In the beginning, God was dancing, leaping for joy. And God was so joyful that God leapt right out of God's self back into God's self. And the Spirit of God was hovering over the surface of the waters, hoping for what was about to happen. And everything that came to be sprang from God's joy. Everything made in joy and for joy. And God was present to it all. And then God said, "Let there be light." And God made the light in color. There's color because of light, and there's light because of color. And you know that anything that is shining in the light shows its true colors. So anything that is showing its true colors, well, you know that it's shining in the light. And God saw that the light was good. And there was evening, and there was morning, the first day. And then God said, "Let there be an expanse to separate the waters." And God called the expanse sky, so there was water above and water below. And there was evening, and there was morning, the second day. And then God said, "Let the waters below be gathered to one place, and let dry ground appear." And God called the dry ground land, and the gathered waters God called the seas. And God saw that the land was good. And then God said, "Let the land produce growing things of all kinds." And God saw that the plants were good. And there was evening, and there was morning, the third day. And then God said, "Let there be lights in the sky to govern the day and the night. Let the greater light govern the day, let the lesser lights govern the night, and let the lights serve as signs of seasons and days and years." And God saw that the lights were good. And there was evening, and there was morning, the fourth day. And then God said, "Let the water teem with living creatures of all kinds, and let the sky above be filled with living creatures of all kinds." And God saw that the living creatures of all the waters below and the sky above were good. And God blessed the living creatures and said, "Be fruitful and increase in number and fill the whole earth." And there was evening, and there was morning, the fifth day. And then God said, "Let the land produce wild animals of all kinds, living, moving creatures that live on the land." And God saw that the wild animals were good. And then God said, "Let us create human beings in our image, male and female." God created them. And God formed the human beings out of the dust of the ground, and God breathed into the human beings the breath of life. And then God looked at all that God had made. And God saw that it was very good. And there was evening, and there was morning, the sixth day. So on the seventh day, God had finished, completed all the work that God had done. So on the seventh day, God rested from God's work. And God blessed the seventh day and made it holy. For on it, God had rested from all the work that God had done. I want to invite you to keep that image in mind of the creation circle. And I wonder I wonder what your favorite part of the story might be. Maybe just a few people can share what your favorite part is. I wonder how you see Sabbath in the midst of all this, Sabbath in the creation story. How do you see that fitting in there? I wonder what you feel the most important part of the story is. And then I have a few notes I kind of want to share. Few people maybe. What do you feel is the most important part of the story? Maybe if you like, you could say the most important part for our lives today, the kind of place and time that we're living in today. And as we think about children's spirituality, I think this is an important story because in this story, there is nothing lacking. Again, going back to this idea of it's complete. There's really nothing lacking in it. There's nothing that any of us need that isn't there. And so you think about that with the vulnerability of children and how we can be underscoring this message as we're working with children. It's all here for you already. That's the grace of God. It's already all been provided. And don't children know that really well before they're even able to express it? I mean, from infancy, they know by experience, it's all already here for you. It will be provided. Um, and so that's something that we can also learn from children, isn't it? Resting in that. How often we worry about how God is going to provide for us. The children don't have that worry. They just They just take it on faith that it will be provided. So we can learn from children, again, going back to this idea that children have something to teach us, as well as us interacting with children and helping them grow and develop. All right, I'm going to share a couple slides now. Sabbath, Eugene Peterson tells us in his book, Christ Plays in 10,000 Places. He tells us that the word Sabbath just means stop. He points out that, you know how we often talk about religious language, we have these special religious words. And Sabbath sounds very much like a religious word, doesn't it? But it isn't really religious in that sense at all. It just means stop. Just quit, stop, rest, cease. And so that's one of the hardest things for us to do, though, isn't it? It's very hard for us to stop. Oh, can you see my slides? You probably can't, can you? Did I share this properly? There we go. Can you see it now? Sabbath means stop. Notice that you can't Sabbath and be in a hurry at the same time. Sabbath shows us that God is not in a hurry. And so when we're working with children, if we want children to have an experience of God, that generally means we need to slow down and pay attention so that we can notice, rather than often what we think in children's ministry is, oh, we have to keep their attention, and so we have to quicken things up. But really, there's something that happens in children when we just slow down and we can just be together in a slow way. We don't have to be in a hurry. That's a Sabbath-like thing. Sabbath, notice, provides this rhythm between work and rest. And what I'd like you to notice about the story is that it began with this kind of big, vast void, this expanse, right? Where the Spirit is hovering over the chaos of just the amorphous waters. At that point, there was water there, but it didn't have shape or form to it yet, really. But God was there in the midst of all that. Notice, at rest through the play, the intrinsic play of God. The early Christians used the image of God dancing in the form of the Trinity. They explained the unity and the diversity of the Trinity through the metaphor of dance, because in dance there's a singularity of essence, the dance itself, but a distinction of persons in cooperation, creating the dance. And so that's how early Christians understood the Trinity. It was the word perichoresis. Peri, around, circle, perimeter. Choresis, our word choreography is related to that. So they portrayed God as the dancing around God. And so you'll notice that there's this joyfulness to it, an activity to God, but it's always a restful activity. So even when God makes, even when God works, it has a restful quality to it. Creation sprang out of the quality of Sabbath. And so that's why it makes sense that in order for it to be completed, you'll notice that there was a balance in the story. On one side of the story, there was one piece, and on the other side of the story, there was a complementary piece. So it is with Sabbath. Before there was anything, there was Sabbath. And so when God finished the special work of making on the 6 days, in order to complete the work, Sabbath is there in the center of it all. So Sabbath, whether we realize it or not, because God and Sabbath go hand in hand,
Sabbath is really kind of forms the center and the circumference of our lives. In Sabbath, we have a sense of God's transcendence. So going back to that definition of childhood spirituality, but I would also add in Sabbath, we capture a sense of God's immanence, God in the midst of us, right here with us. So I would add, Eugene Peterson talks about this in Christ Plays in 10,000 Places, that word spiritual or spirituality is so much more than just something that's ethereal and kind of we can't get our hands on it. But biblically speaking, the Hebrew mindset is that Sabbath is embodied. God wants, that's why he put Sabbath in our midst, imminent to us, so that we kind of, it's one of these phenomena where it's like, well, he wants us to be able to touch it and relate to it, but we'll never be able to totally possess it because. So there's this mystery that we're living in Sabbath, and children have kind of an innate sense of these mysteries. All right, so it provides a rhythm between work and rest that I would say is kind of indicative of play, the play of God. Play is restful activity. Notice that Sabbath can happen anywhere. On the 6 days, much of it was about God creating places, space, things in space. You notice that days 1 through 3, God created places. And then on days 4 through 6, God filled those places with living things. But on day 7, it isn't about a place. Sabbath can happen in any of those places and among any of those kinds of anything in creation can enjoy the quality of Sabbath, that restfulness, resting in the rhythm of God. So Sabbath is about time. And what's interesting about it is that we come to grips with the limits of our control on life because of that. There's one thing that we will never be able to control, and it's time. And so God, as a way to invite us to be like children who don't have a lot of control on their world. They have agency, but they're fairly limited, more limited in their capacity than many grown-ups are in being able to effect change around them. They don't have as much power as older people do. So Sabbath invites us to come and become more like children, to let go of control. We can never control time. And so we're all just God's children. And then in Sabbath, you'll notice that God limits God's self. God becomes like a child in Sabbath because God could have just kept going. God didn't need to stop. Remember, God didn't need to make any of this. God also didn't need to stop making. But God did, to limit God's self. And there's a playfulness in that. One thing I'd like us to notice in the Sabbath story is that, on day 6, the last thing that's created are human beings. And I think we often miss this, that the very next thing that God does after God creates human beings is God then stops. So what that means is, as the first humans, the first impression that they have of God is as someone who basically has said by his action of stopping, you know what? I'm going to stop working just so that I can be with you, these people that I have made, and so that I can be with the creation that I've made. I delight so much in everything that I've made, including you, that I just want to stop to be with you. And that's all I want to do right now. And how playful is that? and how wonderful that is for our spiritual development, including children, when we just stop to just play and say, I'm not here to get something more out of you. I'm not here to put you to work. You know, I'm not even here to teach you anything. I just want to be with you. I want to love you and invite you to love me in return. And so there's just something so beautiful that just fills our souls and our spirits that we do well to keep in mind when we are working with children. That what fills children the most is just when someone comes along and says, I just want to be with you like that. Can we Sabbath together? Can we stop together? And that doesn't mean you have to stop and do nothing. It can mean you can play, but the invitation is to play, to stop, to rest. That kind of making sense? Thumbs up. Let me look at, someone sent me a chat. Okay. What I'd like to do now is just 5 minutes left, is to point out how this interfaces with the definition that I gave in the definition that I gave of play in the first session. Notice that Sabbath feels apparently purposeless. Well, why? What's the point of it? It's voluntary. It can't be forced. It has inherent attraction. We're naturally drawn to that kind of restful place. There's a sense of freedom from time in the midst of it. We're able to get absorbed in who God is through Sabbath. We have a diminished consciousness of self. There is improvisational potential in it because it's playful. There's all kinds of ways to observe Sabbath. And one of the things that many Jewish people do is at the end of Sabbath, they will have kind of like a farewell ceremony on Saturday night where they bid farewell to Queen Sabbath and they say, oh, until we meet again next week. So there's this continuation desire, and you'll notice it repeats over and over and over again. With that in mind, I just want to close with this few tips for families that have children. I encourage people to think about beginning at sunset and ending at sunset. There's something about that, because what it does is we're really getting ready to rest. When you begin at sunset, you're preparing to rest, literally, because you're going to go to bed that night. So you're actually starting out on the right foot when you begin at sunset and end that way. You begin with rest and you return to rest. And then our work is intended to flow out of that rest so that our work has a restful quality to it. It's infused with restfulness. That's how messed up our Western culture has got. We even have time backwards. You'll notice that in the creation story, there was evening and there was morning, the first day. We tend to think of the day as morning and evening. But the Hebraic way of telling time is evening and morning, and that makes a big difference in how we experience Sabbath, not just on the one day, but we experience a Sabbath-like quality infused in all of our days. So also you can get ready for it, plan it together. You could have family meetings and things like that where you're like, okay, what can we play together? How will we rest this Sabbath? And this goes back to that idea that I mentioned in the first session of creating mutually desirable boundaries. If you brainstorm these things together as a family, then the boundaries aren't an issue. It's not about the rules. It's about, we get to do this together because we've come up with it together. I'm a big fan of sticky notes, by the way. You could have a family sticky note exercise to do this. on, say, I don't know, Friday, or whenever sometime before you're going to do Sabbath. Play and pray. Um, you know, feel free to play on the Sabbath, is kind of what I'm trying to get at there. And here are some specific ideas as to how you could play. You could think about having a space dedicated in your home where it's always an altar that's can be contributed to and changed and morphed, and creating something together in a playful kind of way. Share special food, enjoy music together, maybe dance, tap into the imagination when you're reading scripture. Invite people to put themselves in the story, wonder about it, ask wondering questions like what we did just a little while ago. And the examine is also, you could do the examine once a week together on the Sabbath, where you would review your week. One of the things I like about the examine is you can imagine it as taking a walk with Jesus through your week or through your day, and imagine him showing you your own life. And the nice thing about that is he will always do that with you in a loving way, because Jesus is love. God is love. And so if you want someone to show you your life, who better person to accompany you than Jesus in that? And kids, you'll be surprised. Kids are able to do that. Jesus, show me my life. Take a walk with me through my life. Well, those are some rambling thoughts, perhaps a little disorganized on Sabbath. And if you have questions, we can return to those at the end, but I'm out of time now. Thank you for the honor of sharing with you.